I'm talking about the fact that God explicitly says, I do not like that. I do not like people being slaves to other people because their job is to serve me, not them.
So then why would he sanction slavery?
Because it had, by logic, therefore, we have to come to the conclusion that he couldn't outright ban slavery for some reason or another.
So God did not have the literal ability to do so.
Not that God did not have the literal ability to, but that it would accomplish nothing. Otherwise, he would have done it. God doesn't do things that don't accomplish things, because God always things that God does by definition.
This is just a massive assumption. You're just assuming this. What did
No,
God accomplish by not just blatantly outlawing it? If anything, it seems as if God accomplished more slavery throughout the ages, considering slavery was justified here in America by using similar verses from the Bible.
Well, again, justifying it here in America doesn't... They would have done that regardless of what God said about slavery. Yeah, I was the person who wanted to defend the Levitical slavery.
Well, I appreciate you being a viewer and donating today, but I can't guarantee that I'm going to be super nice about this, because to me that sounds fucking delusional.
Yeah, no, I'm not expecting you to like instantly agree with me or to be nice about it, but I'm here to present my view on things. That's all.
So you think that the Levitical slavery that God sanctioned was justified?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
So first and foremost, we need to understand, I mean, of course, we've heard that the slavery of then was different from the slavery of today. I'm not going to, drive that point into the ground. It's already been discussed.
You mean like it wasn't based on it wasn't based on race, right?
Well, not even that. The requirement, how you're supposed to treat your slaves, was very, very different.
I think that we can come to a common agreement, though, was the slavery in the Bible that God endorsed, yes or no, owning another human being as property?
Well, the slavery in the Bible was owning another person as property, yes.
Okay, and so was chattel slavery as well, which was owning another person as property. Just if they may have varied in the treatments of those slaves, still at its core, it had the exact same principle.
Well, I mean, one of the things that you keep saying is that God endorsed it, and I don't agree with that.
He sanctioned it.
He allowed it.
No, he specifically told them where and how to get their slaves.
Yes, you can get it says specifically, if you need to get slaves, if you get slaves, you can get them from here.
Yes, so if I have a child and my rule for my kid is you can't eat cookies, what's the better approach? Either saying nothing about cookies on the counter or saying, hey, I don't want you eating the cookies out of that jar, but if you want to get cookies, you can go into this cabinet here and you can get cookies from there. That kind of sounds like I'm sanctioning my kid eating cookies in that instance, right?
So something that we learned from Prohibition era America is that banning something that people are going to do anyway makes it worse, because then you can't regulate it. So in Prohibition, before Prohibition, there were laws regulating the sale of alcohol to people. There were social contracts regarding how you could treat, who was supposed to drink with whom. When you just outright ban something, there's no way to regulate it. And so what I believe happened was that because that slavery was in this gray zone between too socially acceptable to just outright ban, but not socially acceptable enough to say to not ban it. Like, if God had just said, do not do slavery, like he said, do not mix wool and linen. Like wool and linen, I can shrug my shoulders and be like, you know what, sure. But slavery is this thing that everyone was doing. Society thought it was okay at the time.
It sounds like what you're doing. I understand that rationale, but it's simultaneously weakening God significantly.
I mean, it's not weakening God, it's making him a pragmatist, right? So God...
No, it's weakening God, because if God can go ahead and put in restrictions that restrict them from doing other things that were completely normal and culturally acceptable at the time, but then when it comes to slavery, he's like, well, I'll just tell them not to kill their slaves. They can still beat them, though. Why wouldn't he, if he wanted to recognize that slavery was a thing and wanted to go about this the pragmatic way, why wouldn't he say something like, hey, here's where you can get your slaves, but you need to let them go after 3 years, or something? Instead, it was the opposite.
There's the over year. You have to let your slaves go after a couple of years.
No,
Yes.
those were for certain slaves. There were other slaves that you
Yeah,
could, one,
for Jewish
trick into
slaves.
keeping
They
for
treat
life
Jewish
by giving
slaves
them.
and for non-Jewish slaves. Yes.
Yes, Jewish slaves you could trick into being your slave for life so long as you give them a wife and child.
Well, you couldn't. They could still choose to leave. They just weren't.
But they would have to abandon their wife and child, who
They
were then
would. And again,
slaves and property under
I'm not
those
saying that
rules.
I'm not saying that the way that I'm not saying that the slavery presented in the Bible is the way that is something to strive for. It's not like a good thing. The slavery in the Bible is not a good thing. What I'm saying is that, and this isn't the only case. There are plenty of other cases where God did not outright ban stuff because it was better to put down practical applications. For example, there are those who say that sacrifices, the entire group of animal sacrifices, was because it was common day for people to slaughter their children, and God was trying to work them away from that. But he needed to take baby steps because just saying don't sacrifice anything would not have worked.
But this
And
is
so there,
this. I thought that God is all powerful, omniscient. Isn't he able to see everything and know everything at once? So why couldn't he change the material conditions? God is not a slave to our current material conditions.
God is very much a slave to our material conditions because God in his kindness gives us free will by definition.
That's not free will.
It is free will.
No, God tells us directly not to do other shit all the time.
Right. And you can still choose to do that, and then there are consequences if you do or don't do that. Like, you can choose to. God gives us free will by allowing us to choose our deeds. So and there are actually commentaries.
But God already took harder stances on other deeds that we should not do.
And that's
why is it with slavery he's all of a sudden like, oh, I've got to take the baby steps.
Middle area, because it's right in this middle area between murder is never socially acceptable, and people understand that, and like mixing wool and linen is socially acceptable but not a big deal. But slavery was, because I literally I follow the Levitical law, my guy. I do not mix wool and linen.
Would you be a slave under the Levitical law to somebody else?
It's very possible, yeah.
You realize this is why I had to like preface with like, hey, you know, we're cool, but this is some of the most delusional shit you've told me. Like,
I understand.
I thought that if your belief is in a all-powerful, all-knowing God who is arguably the foundation of morality, and yet all of a sudden now there's the God has to take baby steps and be super pragmatic when it comes to getting rid of owning other people as property. They already wait, hold on. When they were set free, when the Israelites were freed from slavery in Egypt, and then when God gave those laws or those commands, why didn't he just say nothing about slavery?
Because they were very, very used to the concept of owning slaves and being owned as slaves. It was such a common thing.
But why couldn't God have just said nothing about slavery? Not, hey, here's where you can go get your slaves, by the way, LOL.
It's important to him, and he wants to work towards fixing it. That's why he has to talk about it, because if he had said nothing, people would have continued to be okay with it. The fact that he says anything, and if you look in the Gemara, the rabbis are very explicitly clear that just because you're allowed to beat your slaves, if you read Maimonides, he has a whole book on this topic, and he says you're not allowed to you're technically allowed to beat your slaves, but you're not allowed to do wrong by them. Don't harm them. Don't be rude to them. Don't yell at them.
You can beat them so long as they don't die.
It says if you beat them,
and
then
if they don't die as a direct result of the beating, then
Correct.
you are to go unpunished. That's what it says.
There's a difference between saying you are allowed to beat them and you should beat them.
Okay, this is why I say God sanctioned it. God didn't say, hey, go and beat the fuck out of your slaves, ha ha ha. God said, yo, if you beat your slaves, then, here's how to deal with it. He sanctioned it. He made way for slavery to still happen under his rule. Yes. That is sanctioning slavery. That's immoral.
Under his rule.
That's immoral.
But, I mean, the question is, can you do something immoral now for the sake of making it better in the future?
If you can, I recognize the argument would be that only God could know that. But I fail to see how that even played out, because a lot of the Levitical laws and the biblical texts about slavery were also used to justify chattel slavery here in America.
You can use the Bible to justify basically anything you want. That doesn't mean it's the correct interpretation.
My point is, if God had some ultimate long-term plan here, where the fuck is the long-term plan if his book, in regards to what he said about slavery, was being invoked to justify chattel slavery here in America as well?
Well, I mean, one of the big things that separates Judaism from Christianity is the oral law, right? So we have a tradition that there's a lot of the text that wasn't there was a lot of discussion in text that wasn't written down like in the written law. The way I like to imagine is a couch from IKEA, right? So you can get the physical couch, but if you don't have the instruction manual, you're going to assemble the couch wrong. So we have this oral law, and the oral law is very clear on their view on slavery. In fact, it goes so far as to say that one who acquires a slave acquires for himself a master, because you have to treat your slaves better than you treat yourself. You
I
have
don't know if
to.
that's true. And even if that were the case,
That
I
is.
don't really care.
I can
Owning
give
another
examples as
person
to
as
why that's true.
property
I
against
mean,
their
what does it
will,
mean to own someone as property to begin with?
it
What does that
means that
mean?
it means, just like what the Bible says, that they are your slave for life. They cannot leave, so they don't have the freedom to leave, and you can bequeath them to your children because they are
If
your
they
property.
Part of the law is if they run away, you're not allowed to return them to their master. That's part of the
I
oral
don't
law.
care. God sanctioned owning other human beings as property, which we all, even intuitively almost, recognize that that's fucking wrong.
But the point the first off, being able to bequeath them to your children is like I don't really see what that particular issue is. It's like if they're property, not property, just being able to bequeath them to your children doesn't change anything. But the
Yeah, it
question is
does. It
whether or not
indicates that God views them as property first and foremost.
yes, and there are times where God views humans as property. This isn't the first time. Humans have a numerical what's it called? Humans have a numerical value. They have a monetary value
I genuinely don't know why you want to go this route. We tend to
because
recognize, partially because of the not only the Enlightenment and secular morality, but literally the reason we have these views about humans having intrinsic value, especially here in America, partially originated from Judeo-Christian values, that God created human
yes,
beings with some kind of intrinsic value. So I don't know
yes.
why you would want to confidently get up here and say, well, God also views people as property sometimes, LOL. This doesn't justify God sanctioning slavery.
I mean, it's in line. Like the thing is that humans have value, right? Humans have intrinsic value. I don't
So
know
why would
what
God then say that they could own those people with intrinsic value as property?
because that intrinsic value has a number. You can put a number to their value. But regardless, what matters is I don't think that God was okay with slavery. I think going back to the original point that I was trying to make, it's not that, and you see this also by prisoners of war and also by sacrifices.
So first of all, what you say, hold on, wait. What you say is, I don't think God, that doesn't matter. You're now claiming to speak for God.
I'm saying I don't think God. I'm not saying this is what God is doing. I'm saying I don't believe. I recognize that
I don't
I
know
can't
how
speak
you
for
would
God
just decide that. It sounds like because it's more comfortable for you.
because God is a rational being, and the most rational argument is the one that makes the most sense. Like God is a lot of
The
things,
thing that's most rational is, thou shalt not own another human being as property.
right? And if that's an obtainable goal, that's a great commandment. If it's not an obtainable goal, it's a useless commandment. But
I,
if
it was an attainable goal, clearly, because first of all, they were starting off without slaves. And
it was
second
an
of all,
obtainable
God
goal over
clearly, and
time,
they as well, the Israelites clearly, as along with God, viewed slavery as being wrong, considering they were just freed from slavery from Egypt.
but the Jews actually in multiple places in the Bible, the Jews were like, "Please, we want to go back to Egypt. Let us be slaves again."
I know.
Like,
And that was
over and
supposed to
over.
be a testament to how ungrateful they were to God saving them.
Right, but it is also indicative of the fact that they were not past the concept of being slaves. They were not past the concept of slavery. They were that indicates
It
that
doesn't
they
matter.
still
It was
thought
clear
slavery
that
was
they had
okay.
a general understanding that slavery was bad, and it's especially clear that God himself had an understanding that slavery was bad. Because
Right,
he
and I
freed
think
his people from slavery in Egypt, and in doing so also murdered the firstborn sons. So it's
right.
obvious that God
I mean,
had something wrong with slavery, but then it was he's
here's
fine
the
with
thing.
slavery for his people?
Well, here's the thing: is that you can also see, if I think, yeah, this is by a Jewish slave in particular. If a Jewish slave's time is up, like he's no longer obligated to be a slave because there's an amount of time if you go into slavery because of a financial issue, there's an amount of time. And if he says, "I want to remain with my master, I do not want to go free," he gets punished because his job as a Jew is to serve God, and God does not like him serving other people. That's That's outright, like,
I know there
we
was
know
some
that.
slavery like that where they would willingly sell themselves into slavery. And honestly, I feel like that would be a conversation for another time.
That's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm talking about the fact that God explicitly says, I do not like that. I do not like people being slaves to other people because their job is to serve me, not them.
So then why would he sanction slavery?
Because it had, by logic, therefore, we have to come to the conclusion that he couldn't outright ban slavery for some reason or
So
another.
God did not have the literal ability to do so.
Not that God did not have the literal ability to, but that it would accomplish nothing. Otherwise, he would have done it. God doesn't do things that don't accomplish things, because the things that God
This
does by
is just a
definition have.
massive assumption. You're just assuming this. What did
No, I
God
know that.
accomplish by not just blatantly outlawing it? If anything, it seems as if God accomplished more slavery throughout the ages, considering slavery was justified here in America by using similar verses from the Bible.
Well, again, justifying it here in America doesn't. They would have done that regardless of what God said about slavery. They would have used the Bible regardless. But what's important is that
You don't know that. You literally don't know that. They may have invoked their God to justify slavery, but it would probably have helped to not have verses that seemed very clear cut about slavery being okay and slaves obey your master. Mind you, even in the New
I don't
Testament, they
have
say
slaves obey a
slaves.
master. I don't hold by the New Testament.
Okay,
That's
fine, but I'll just say them for the sake of argument for people
Yeah,
listening. Even in the New Testament, in First or Second Peter, they say slaves obey your masters, even the masters who are harsh to you.
right. We don't have that.
So
Like
you just have the Old Testament law where God says you can beat your slaves. Here's where to get them.
well, we've got the Old Testament law and the oral law, which is, again, which there's a lot of discussion in the oral law about literally every commandment. And the rabbis in the oral law are very, very clear. They are not fans of slavery, and that God is not a fan of slavery. But
Okay,
what's important,
why should I believe them when it's just saying when it
because
directly says in the Bible?
because it also directly says in the Bible that you pierce his ear if he wants to continue being a slave for not listening to his purpose of serving God. The fact that contradiction exists must mean either that God doesn't exist or that God didn't write the Bible, but obviously I'm not going there. If we are to
Probably
presuppose,
both would be the
right, well,
answer there.
if we are to presuppose that God exists and wrote the Bible, and we are to presuppose that this contradiction exists, it therefore must be that for whatever reason, either for the sake of free will or for some other unforeseeable reason, I believe it's for the sake of free will because then the pieces fall into place. If it's because as a society they were not ready to accept that law yet, then it forces the situation to be that God bowed his head basically to the people at the time and said, "You are not ready for this commandment yet. But here is the stepping stones. This is where we start. This is where we go
This
from
just
here."
does not make any sense to me because they were plenty ready for all the other commandments. The other,
Not really.
thou shalt not lust after another woman. The thou shalt not have any idols before me, where they literally
They didn't
unironically.
listen to that.
I know
We
they
can
went ahead
see
and
a
still
case
had
where,
idols, but you
God
know what?
tried
It
it and
works
it
better
still didn't
when.
help.
Hold on. Then they were violating a command from God, and God was able to punish them.
Right?
If I'm remembering the story correctly, they were punished for the
He
golden
did that
calf.
over and over. Yes.
So why then would God not say, hey, don't do slavery? Even if they do slavery, then he could punish them more swiftly. Not,
Because
hey, if you want to get slaves, you should get them from over here. Oh, and by the way, they're your property. Oh, and by the way, as long
because
as you beat them and don't actually fucking murder them, well, then it's A-okay with me. That's not like a
because
God
here's
easing
why.
out of
Here's the
slavery
difference.
bullshit.
Here's the difference. By idolatry, it's between man and God, and he can outright ban it and whatever. By idolatry, he needs this because, as I said, by prohibition, it's useful to regulate it. So by adding regulations, which I can agree with you, probably could have been written a bit more strictly, but the point is that by not outright banning it and instead adding regulations, he was able to push them in the right direction. Because if he had just said don't have slaves, then he couldn't put these regulations on. He couldn't say let them go after I think it's 7 years.
You
He
just
couldn't
said
say
that
feed
God
them
is
before you feed them
logical.
stuff.
How on earth would God not be able to say, hey, first and foremost, don't have slaves. If for some reason you violate this command and you do get slaves, here's the punishment, and I expect you to treat those slaves with respect until I step in and break this thing up or
Because it's better
whatever.
to accidentally sin than to sin on purpose.
What?
If you see someone committing a sin and you know that they won't listen to you if you tell them that they're committing a sin, you should not tell them it's a sin because they're not allowed, because then they're sinning on purpose, and sinning on purpose is worse than sinning by accident.
This is the most delusional mental gymnastic I've ever heard in my life. Then
It is
why didn't
definitely
God
mental
ever tell
gymnastics.
people not to then why did God ever tell people not to kill? If only then they were killing, they would have been sinning on accident.
What? Because not killing is something that was never, there was never socially acceptable to just kill.
That's not even necessarily true. I've brought up examples of ancient civilizations where it was actually quite common to kill.
Not this. I'm talking about that society in particular. Like the fact of the matter is, I mean, yes, I will concede the point that this is a lot of like workaround logic. It is not straightforward.
It's not
But
even logic. It's illogical because if God is able to outlaw all these other things and God was still able to regulate things that he first and foremost said, don't do this, then I don't know why God would be stuck, essentially controlled by what was popular and socially acceptable at the time, so he couldn't make rules against that one thing.
because slavery is such a big, because as we saw by like in America, slavery is something that needs to be like extremely closely regulated if it's going to happen at all. Like for like the other laws, if God banned them, that's like okay, God banned them, you break it, it's a sin, whatever. But by slavery in particular, he has to regulate it in a capacity because it can be incredibly harmful. It has to be
It
regulated.
is incredibly harmful, which I don't
Yes,
understand. Wait, why couldn't God regulate it while also saying on the foundation, the foundational rule here is do not have slaves? Why couldn't it have literally I would even understand your point honestly, and I still wouldn't be satisfied by this, but at least you'd have some like weight to your argument if there was something in the Bible that said ideally you should not have slaves at all.
I showed you that.
But
Yes, I showed you
if
that.
you do get slaves, here's how you should treat them.
Yes, there is that directly in the Bible. I told you about
What
that.
verse?
I don't remember if it's in the Gemara or in the text of the Torah itself, but you're supposed to
It
pierce
would have
his
to be in the
ear.
Bible specifically.
Right. Well, I don't. I'd have to look it up. I can send that to you in a DM on Discord. But what's important is that, well, first off, that's invalidating like half the right because like you don't have the oral law, but I believe firmly that the written law and the oral law are connected. So
I don't
if I'm
understand
going to
why
use it
God
at
couldn't
all,
just work to abolish slavery. Like these are apparently
but
his
but what
people
I'm saying,
that are
but like
created in his image, and apparently God was so controlled by the current social standards that he had to instead sanction slavery and give rules for how to beat your slaves so long as they don't die, which then led to a justification of even worse chattel slavery here in America before Thomas Jefferson and a bunch of other people basically came to the conclusion that we should start working to abolish slaves. What is God's big ultimate plan here? I don't
God's
understand it.
plan is to outlaw things over time so that it's not a culture. Like, well,
Over
first
time,
off,
we're talking
I
about
want to get
slavery here, dude. This isn't something that you should be interested in outlawing over time. Slavery existed for hundreds upon hundreds of years after that Levitical law.
yes. Well, first off, I'd like to respond to your original question of where we see God saying, "Hey, don't have slaves." And as I mentioned before, if a slave wants to stay a slave, you pierce his ear, you pierce his earlobe to the door or something like that to indicate the fact that God does not want people serving other people. God wants people to be serving God. And
So couldn't
we
you have a
see
slave who was just really dedicated to God?
no. That's the very issue is that you can't because they have to serve their master.
Then why did he
God
sanction slavery?
because by if he had outright banned it, he couldn't regulate it and the people would ignore the law.
You're just making assumptions. I've never heard anybody say I can't outlaw, I cannot outright say this thing is bad and also regulate it. Like,
That's
we do
literally
that
what
right now. Our mere mortal minds here in the tiny pea brained humans who are just a speck of sand in comparison to God Almighty, we're able to say, hey, drugs are illegal, but if you do drugs, here's the best way to regulate them. Like, we are even able to look into the nuances of certain issues like that.
that presupposes that you're okay with them. That presupposes that you're okay with them doing drugs,
It
and making that you're
presupposes that
okay
there
with
is
fucking them up.
something, there is a way to regulate illicit behavior in a way while still having the foundational principle be do not do this thing.
Okay, and what we see here is that God is not okay with it because of the fact that you pierce his ear. And God, we see there are other, for example, by I think it was King Solomon or King Saul, I can never remember which. They go to God and they say, God, the people want me to give them a king, and God's like, no, and he says they're like they really want a king. God says, okay, fine. And we see also by the slaves, the people are like, hey, we want to send slaves in, and Moses goes to God, and God says it's a bad idea, and Moses says, yeah, but they really want to go in, and God says, okay,
I don't
do what
believe
you
you.
want. That's literally in the text.
I'm going to read Leviticus 25 right here on stream.
That one wasn't Leviticus. That one wasn't Leviticus. That was Deuteronomy something or other
This says,
about
the
God.
Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai,
Yes.
speak to the Israelites and say to them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you could say to them was, let's see. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. That's not even, that's a direct, that's allowing that. If the police officer says, hey, if you're going to speed, go speed on this road, okay? And on that road, you can speed. That is the police officer telling me that I can break the law in that situation. This is God directly saying that you can buy slaves.
Yes. God was allowing them to buy slaves.
He okayed it. He wasn't just like
God
standing back
okayed
and
them
allowing
buying
this thing to
slaves.
happen. He
God
directly
okayed
said,
them buying
here you
slaves at
can
the
do
time.
it.
Yes. I will concede that God okayed them buying slaves at the time. I never said
Where
that
is
he
the
didn't.
text of God condemning slavery?
I can go try and dig it up real quick if you like. It would take me a little bit, but I could find it.
You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life.
Let me just see here. Pierce ear. Exodus 21:6. He shall be brought to the door of the post. His master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and then he will remain the
Which
master's
one?
slave for life.
Exodus 26?
21:6.
Gotcha. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go 3 without paying anything. Yeah, but you can trick them to stay. Right here. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost.
Okay. Yeah, no, that word that they use as judges is actually another word for God. It's translated in different places, but here
so take him to God. He shall then take him to the door and pierce his ear. Then he will be a servant for life.
Yes.
If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as men's servants do. Yikes, man.
Yeah, no, it is pretty yikesy. I'm not saying it isn't. It is 100% yikesy. But what matters is that this is indicative, this doorpost thing, as we see in various commentaries, is that God does not like people serving other people. He wants them to be serving him.
Why then is he okay with people being servants for life for a master?
Because those people indicated that they did not want to serve God. That person indicated
no, they've indicated that they want to stay with their wife and child.
And that they don't want to serve God.
So it's either serve God and abandon your wife and children, or remain a slave for life and stay with your wife and child? That's the option here?
That's on the master if that happens.
Dude,
that's if the master gave him a wife, right? But that's on the master to torture him like that. That's not God's fault if he does that.
God is the one directly saying that you can do this if you give him a wife and child.
Yes, but again, that person can still choose to go free.
Why then would God not say, if the slave wants to go free, then he shall go along with his wife and child?
I don't know.
It doesn't sound very logical. You said that God was logical. This is illogical.
God is logical. I only believe that God is logical.
This is illogical.
I don't know that it's illogical.
I thought it was like a Christian biblical value to have families stay together.
Not always. No, I mean there are times where there are laws about when you're allowed and when you're supposed to divorce your wife in Judaism.
Also, someone's pointing out as well in chat, this is only for Hebrew slaves. This doesn't apply to the other slaves that you purchased from the heathen nations around you.
You're not going to like this, but there are a lot of things that are like that. It's very distinctly
where God is like, hey, you can have the nice fluffier version of slavery for my people, but for all the other creepy heathens, well, just fucking keep them for life. Beat them as long as they don't die, LOL.
It's kind of cringe, but that's something I just kind of have to accept in Judaism, is that it's not a huge fan of non-Jews. Like that's a bullet I have to bite.
Okay,
Um,
that's if you're
like
willing to bite that, that's fine. But
I'm willing to bite the bullet that Judaism is not a fan of non-Jews. Of
but this
course,
is just
also if you,
ridiculously contradictory, nonstop.
I
Nowhere does
don't
it say
think
that
it's
God
contradictory.
isn't okay with slavery. It says the
The
opposite.
ear thing, the piercing the ear thing, as we see in the commentaries in the oral law, but which I remind you is directly from Sinai as well. The oral law explicitly outlines the fact that that is because he wants to serve his master and not God, and outlines in great detail how you're supposed to treat your slaves. You're supposed to feed them before you feed yourself. You're supposed to give them more comfortable beds than you
I
sleep
don't
on.
care. These
Care about the
these are
bad things, but
irrelevant.
don't
This
care
is
about.
like you may have a sex slave who you rape every day. Okay, we would both say that's fucked. That's disgusting. Oh,
Yes,
but you must make sure that your sex slave is fed and comfortable in a nice comfy bed every night. You'd probably say, "Okay, well that's better than starving them, but I mean they're still your sex slave." In this
right.
case, maybe God is saying, "Yeah, give them a nice comfy bed or whatever, but they're your slave." And apparently you're telling me that God values free will so much that he's restricting other people's ability to live their free will
No, they can
to
live their
instead
free
be
will.
slaves.
If a slave runs away, you're not allowed to return him to his master. If a slave leaves of his own free
So
will,
if they
you're not
run
allowed
away, if they somehow figure out how to escape,
to return them to their master. No,
okay, you're jumping
that's the
through
law.
so many
No,
hoops
that's
right
the
now.
law. If a slave escapes, you're not allowed to return him to his
I'm
master.
watching your like videotape to try out for the gymnastics. Like
No,
you're
what?
jumping through so many hoops to try and
Yes.
justify
Again,
this.
this isn't straight. I am not one to say that the Bible is simple or straightforward. That's a Christian belief. The
The
Bible is complicated as all hell.
which
It's
is an
complicated. It requires
argument
a
in and
lot
of
of
itself, and again speaks volumes against the God, which is apparently in the Bible labels God not the author of confusion, yet
that's again, I'm pretty sure that's not in the Old Testament. That's all New Testament, Mr. Guys.
I
God
think
is
I actually, you know what, I
definitely the
think that was
author.
from the New Testament.
Yeah, I don't believe in the New Testament. God 100% is the author of confusion.
So
God
God
writes.
purposely tries to confuse his
Yes,
people?
yes, 100%.
You believe in a really fucked up God.
Oh yeah, for sure. I
And
mean,
that's not like a
you can
diss. That's like it's
you can call it what you want, but the reason that God makes things complicated is because then you can be rewarded for figuring it out, and B so that people don't misuse it, which is ironically not how it was applied.
wait, no, it's easier to be misused if it's confusing and vague
Yes,
than
I
if it
know,
were
and
more
I don't understand that.
straightforward.
I don't understand exactly how they came to that conclusion,
That seems
but
illogical.
yeah, it seems illogical to me too. But what matters is the fact that God made it confusing because the more important things, like all the way deep important things, not like even moral things, just like the spiritual mysticism stuff, is shrouded in mystery upon mystery upon mystery, written in all kinds of code, because these
So
things
you're
are
telling me there's a
important.
God that exists. What's your opinion on hell?
Hell. Oh yeah, Jewish hell is very different from Christian hell. Jewish hell is closer to purgatory. So
So do people go to purgatory if they don't believe in God?
it's it depends on A if they're Jewish and B how you read that commandment.
How
Um,
is it generally understood that like is faith the number one big thing like in Christianity or
it's not. I mean, it's not. So I've actually talked to rabbis about this. Like one of the rabbis asked someone like, "Hey, why aren't you following these commandments?" And they're like, "Well, I don't believe in God." And the rabbi was like, "Okay, that doesn't give you the right to ignore the other 612. Like, believing in God is a commandment. Do it or don't."
so you have
Um,
to follow God's commands in order to get to heaven.
yes, you
But
have to
God's
follow the
commands
commandments.
are purposely vague.
They're only purposely vague because we have the oral law to explain them in detail.
So God's commands are purposely vague and somewhat contradictory and also confusing and shrouded in mystery, as you said. But if you
Yes.
don't believe those or follow those commands accurately, then you risk going to purgatory for all of eternity.
No, 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 no. It's up to 12 months. You can go to hell for up to 12 months human time.
And then you get out of hell.
Yeah, and then you go get your eternal reward. Or if you're really, really bad, and we're not talking like atheist bad, we're talking like Hitler style bad. Then either you continue burning there, or your soul like poofs out of existence, depending on who you ask. But after your maximum 12 months in hell for anyone that isn't basically a mass murderer, then you just get to go to heaven and you get your eternal reward for the commandments that you do keep.
Okay, I can appreciate that that sounds like a nicer version than most Christianity, so that's cool. But again, I would still say that there's an argument to be made that it's unjust to be punishing people for any length of time for not following commands which you have intentionally set up to be confusing.
I mean, the thing is not to view it less as a punishment and more of like a process.
Wait, no, it's the process involves a punishment. That's come on, you're being Weasley there, and I think you know that.
No, what I'm saying is that like sin dirties the soul, and hell is a cleansing process.
Bruh, if
Everyone
I
goes
am
there.
driving around and there's a big sign on the road that says the speed limit is 45 miles an hour, but also if you feel like it, it's 35 miles an hour, and 2 feet ahead, it's 50 miles an hour, and then I get pulled over for going 50 miles an hour, and the cop says, no, didn't you see the sign where it said 45 miles an hour first before 50? And then I go to jail for 12 months? That would be pretty unfair because
No,
that
it's
law
not.
was
It's
so
not.
confusing and
Again,
unclear.
first off, it's a maximum of 12 months. Every sin every this is another thing I have against Christians. Every sin has its own value, and you don't get maximum 12 months in hell for small sin. Like each sin has its own value that gets you sent to hell for a period of time. It's not all again, 12 months is a maximum, not the standard. In fact, most of the time we assume that people don't go there for 12 months.
Is
But
this
what's
grounded
important
on
to
anything, or are you just kind of like making this up as we
this is
go?
all in the oral law. And there's traditions founded on it.
How do you
So
know
for
that the
example,
oral law is to be trusted?
because we have a tradition dating. If I can trust the written law, I can trust the oral law. Like that's
How do you
just the
know
way.
that the oral law is accurate if it's based on the written law, which you said is vague and confusing?
That's we. The oral law has plenty of mistakes in it. That's the thing. That's why there's so many different traditions in Judaism. Is because there's so many different. There's 70 faces to the Bible. Judaism. If you're making a good faith effort to follow the religion, God is okay with it.
I just
Like
okay. That's I
that's
can
the thing.
appreciate that
If
you
you're trying
obviously
your
have
best,
you obviously have
it,
a nicer version of religion than some people, but still your religion causes you to play defense for God sanctioning slavery,
yes,
and
there are times.
causes you
There are
to just
times.
straight up acknowledge that God is either a slave himself to the cultural norms or that God is purposely confusing and that we're still going to be punished for not following the commands as best as we could have, even though God is the one apparently intentionally making them confusing.
Well, see, the thing is that it's written in the oral law and ethics of the fathers. Get for yourself a rabbi. The important thing
Why
is
should I
that
trust the rabbi?
you should trust you should get a rabbi that you trust is the
Why should
point.
I get a rabbi at all? Why should I
Because,
trust any
because
rabbi?
the laws are confusing and someone needs to explain them to you.
Who's
Because
to
the
say
laws
the
are
rabbi has a better understanding?
because he spends his they don't just hand out the title of rabbi willy-nilly.
I
Like
know, but I'm saying
if
like
you find a rabbi that you trust will explain the laws to you correctly,
so it's just
same
a
way you go
rabbi
to
that read through it and then decided to give their version of an
no,
interpretation
it's
on
a
the vague law,
rabbi
and then if you
that
agree with that, you
through
go with them?
It's a rabbi that you read through, studied for multiple years, and got approved by other rabbis. This is a tradition we have dating back hundreds of years. And you rely on that rabbi, and if that rabbi is a reliable one, or if you believe that rabbi to be a reliable one, then you follow him. And if God sees that you're making an effort, God is okay with it. Yes,
Okay.
as long as you're acting with intent to. It's not
Unless
about
you're, whether or not your intent to own slaves or not, apparently is where God kind of draws the
owning
line
slaves is
there.
now forbidden. Owning slaves is explicitly forbidden now.
It is explicitly forbidden?
I believe so.
How did you even
Yeah.
come to that conclusion if you're only following the Old Testament? I mean, there's nothing
There's
really
no
in the New Testament either. But
there's a commandment that you have to follow the laws of the land you live in at the very least. So even if nothing else, the fact that it's outlawed in America means that it's illegal, means that it's a sin. Because you have to follow the laws of the place that you're in. But even if that wasn't the case, I mean that's a big deal because it means that like speeding is a sin.
I mean,
Uh,
okay, that's fine, I guess, but in a way, I mean, I don't think that people should be going to hell for speeding in their car.
again, there's a difference between sins done on purpose, sins done on accident. Why you do sins on purpose? Do you do it because you can't control yourself, or because you're trying to like
I just
sins
this
are
makes
these little
God sound so fucking subject to the times. So, for
yes,
example, you're telling
yeah,
me that if
100%
hold on,
having
wait, you're telling me that
situations.
if the law right now is that slavery is okay, it would then not be a sin to get a slave.
I mean, to a capacity, yeah.
Okay. So then that God cannot then be moral because God is not actually making any moral foundations or moral claims. Instead, God is just saying, well, I guess I'll just leave it up to the mere mortal humans with the tiny pea brains. Whatever their law is, just follow
I
that.
won't allow you to make this argument
Huh?
because I won't allow you to make this argument because you also talk about we see by the laws of Beged Isha, men wearing women's clothing and vice versa. Well, clothing is socially defined,
I
right? So
agree.
how could you possibly have this commandment if clothing is socially defined?
I make that argument all the time.
Right. That's what I'm saying. That's why I won't allow you to make that argument.
No,
Is because
wearing clothes based on what is and is not socially defined is very different from owning other people as property.
what I'm saying is that this is
Hold
indicative
on, wait.
of
Can we just
limitations
distinguish
where
between these two things? Is that wearing clothes, whether it's a man's clothing or a woman's clothing, and even though that's vague and dependent on what is culturally viewed that way, that doesn't do a harm. Owning other people as property
I'm
does.
not saying that they're equal. I'm not saying that they're equal, but what I am saying is that we see places where God leaves morality to the people. And in fact, we see in the oral law where the rabbis would not let God change the law. There was an argument called the Avallone Achnai. It's an impressive argument because the rabbis killed God before Nietzsche got there. God, one of the rabbis cited God in an argument. He was like, "If I am right, let God be my witness." And a voice came down from heaven and said, "This rabbi is correct." And the other rabbis stood up and said, "The law is not in heaven," which is a line from the text of the Bible. God does not get to make the laws anymore. It is based on at that time it was based on the majority rule of the men of the Great Assembly. God does not get a say in the lawmaking process after that point.
Okay,
God leaves a lot of morality up to man.
so then you're acknowledging then that the version of God that you follow is not in fact the arbiter of morals.
It's the arbiter of fundamental morals.
So no, that's literally not even true, because if the law of the land is slavery is okay, then that means according to God, morally speaking, it's also okay to have slaves.
In a capacity, yeah.
So where is the morals? Where's the moral foundation? A moral foundation is this is the way things are, this is what is moral and immoral, regardless of anything else. That's what objective morality is anyway.
Moral. This is the way things ought to be is moral. This is the way things are is not a moral statement.
Wait, but you're saying that God views morality essentially it's hingent upon the law of the land. So if the law of the land is that slavery is okay, or that it's okay to rape, or any of the then that would be moral because God is contingent.
Again, no. The things that there are things that God outright directly banned, and those things, regardless of what modern society says, you're not allowed to do. The fact that God did not outright ban slavery, I will concede, is not good for optics. It's not a good look. I'll concede that. It's
more
just
than an optics thing. It's like a nail in the coffin for this God being the arbiter of morality.
I'm not convinced.
Huh?
First off, God no longer gets to, as I said before, God no longer gets to arbitrate morality.
That's what I'm asking you, right? So if God is no longer oh my God,
this is what the laws are.
If God is no longer making morals for us, and instead it is now up to us, that means, according to your religion, that God's morals are whatever is recognized as being culturally moral.
This isn't like complete. It's not 100%. The things that God outright banned
are outright banned.
There are things that God outright banned. Murder, if it was socially acceptable, would still be banned.
Okay, I got it. I understand now. So now we've gone full circle where slavery is unironically okay, according to God, both based on what God himself has said, and so long as the law changes to actually slaves are okay, you can then go out and purchase a slave and you will not be punished by God for that.
A YouTuber I watched once, I think his name was Hunter, I like to say that society was moving towards a more moral concept, and that, we don't necessarily need God to point to, what is moral, because we can see that humans like to be moral, that humans have implicit guilt.
So what? I'm giving you a hypothetical.
Why are you mad at God for assuming that too?
I'm giving you a hypothetical.
Well, right.
Hypothetically, your God is a weakling who is extremely flimsy and is literally just basically controlled by whatever is culturally recognized. That is not a very good God or moral foundation. Me, for example, I have my secular moral foundation, which says, let us work in the best interests of human flourishing. If I see slavery happen, I can say, no, I don't care if it says slavery is now legal according to the Supreme Court. I'm not going to partake in that behavior because I recognize it as being immoral. Your God is saying slavery is bad because the law, but if the law changes, then slavery is then good.
I'm not talking about like literal law. I'm talking about the cultural like mores. I'm not talking about like literally the text of the law. I'm talking about the social mores at the time. But
This
what's
is
important is
so
that
if it became moral or if it became normal culturally for like bestiality, would that be acceptable?
no, because there are things that God outright banned. I will
Okay.
concede
I
that
got it.
slavery
So it's
was something that
slavery is the one sticking
yes,
thing
I
where
will
God never
concede
outright banned
that
it,
slavery
which
should have yes, I will concede that slavery should have been outright banned
okay.
because I do not think it moral. I'll concede that. But what I'm
Okay,
trying
I'm
to
glad
say
you conceded it, but that's almost even more damning because now you do have a God who is willing to give some morals that you should follow regardless, but something as pertinent and as massive and as large as a human rights violation as slavery, that's just left up to whatever is culturally acceptable.
no, because
That's what you.
even if slavery was made okay,
That's what you just
there
said.
would no. Here's the difference. If slavery was made okay, that wouldn't free you from the obligations to treat the slaves correctly.
It's not about treating the slaves correctly. Holy
It is.
shit!
We
It's
see
about
that
whether or
God
not you're purchasing other people.
we see that God is not a fan of slavery. And again, I gave you
You don't
why
have
I
to be a
believe that
fan.
God had to not outright ban
I know,
slavery.
and I'm not a fan of cookies, but I just tell my kids where they can get their cookies and how many cookies they can eat.
That's okay, good for you.
Like,
Like
that's not the
if
same
God
as me saying no cookies.
like again, I understand where you're coming from. And then we're going to have to agree to disagree on that point.
I think we
Because
have
the
to agree to disagree about continuing this conversation.
fair. I mean, we're kind of going in circles. Like I'm just trying to present the concept that God isn't necessarily a weakling for this. This is a kindness that God gives us.
It's not a
Like
kindness to the slaves.
it's yes, it's not a kindness to the slaves. It's a kindness that God gives us the free will and allows us to choose within reason what is and isn't moral.
God
So
could
that
have done
way,
that by first laying out that it's immoral to own slaves and then
yes, he
let
could
us
have.
know, leave it up to our free will
Again,
to decide if we're going to partake in
yes,
immoral
and
or
I will
moral
concede
behavior.
that he probably should. That's the one case where I'm like, yes, I concede that that's not a great like thing. I'm biting that bullet. I'm on your side here.
But
It's
you
not a
biting that
great thing.
bullet is all I needed. You've
I
agreed
don't
essentially with my
I don't
concept.
concede that. I don't concede that that's all you need. Because what's important is that this morality is based on doing the best you can. That God puts us here and doesn't expect perfection of us. He doesn't want perfection of us. God says, here's a fundamental morality. Do your best with it.
Okay. But
That's
that
all.
fundamental morality didn't include slavery bad,
Yeah, again,
which
that's
is like a kindergartner understanding of what is and isn't moral.
only in modern day. It didn't used to be. At the time, slavery was perfectly acceptable. The fact that God said you're not allowed to kill your slaves was novel in its own right.
Okay.
There's again, this slavery is a bad look. It's a bad thing, but I don't think it completely debunks the entire concept of God being moral because morality is constantly improving.
I
The
have no
religion,
idea how you could argue that, but okay, that's fine. If you have a God that is sanctioning immoral behavior, explaining how to partake in said immoral behavior, I do not then know how that follows that, oh well, but God is still the arbiter of morals. God just sometimes tells us to do things that are immoral,
it's not. He's not telling you to do things that are
telling us
immoral.
how to do things that are immoral.
Telling you that you're allowed to. Not even that. So there's a difference in Judaism between doing something like from lechatchila, from the beginning, and if it happened. So if and the laws are very different. So if I mix in my plants, if I mix I don't remember what it was, the things that make an orange or whatever it was, you're not allowed to mix them to because it's considered forbidden by the Levitical law to mix specific kinds of plants or whatever. But if those plants were grown by someone, I'm allowed to gain benefit from them. There's a very large distinction in Judaism between what you should do and what you do if it happens. So God is not saying
But
you
then you're
should be.
further debunking what you said earlier. You said that God, if he just said don't do this, that he then couldn't regulate it. But now you're
Right.
giving me an example in Judaism where there are rules where something is said, don't do this, but if this happens, here's how to regulate it.
And that's exactly what we see here. If you
You
have
said
slaves,
God didn't do that in regards to slavery.
I'm saying that God couldn't completely regulate it if he said it was outright banned.
But he could completely regulate and outright ban the plant thing?
the plant thing is a lot less socially acceptable than having slaves at that time.
I don't even
Again,
know
that's
anything.
why I said
Okay.
it's in that middle area between being societally acceptable and like being too hard for the culture to change in a jump and being too easy for them to change.
The
That's
culture could have changed even if it wasn't in a jump. It could have changed more rapidly had God taken a harder stance against something
I'll
so
concede
fucking
that. I'll
immoral.
concede that. I will concede that it would have been better in my mind for God to have outright said slavery is bad. I don't know why he didn't.
Well,
I don't speak for God. I don't know
well,
why he
God works
didn't.
in mysterious ways.
He certainly does.
So, all right. Well, thanks for
Anyway,
coming on. I
no
once again
problem, Theo.
appreciate the donos, and I kind of had a feeling this convo would get a little bit hot, but either way,
Yeah, me
have a good
too. I
rest of your
mean,
day. At least think about what I said.
no, I definitely get it. You're not the first person I discussed this with.
All right. Sounds
It
good.
was a good conversation though. Good talk.
Good talk. See you later. Hey, yay. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click the bell so you get notified when I drop a new video.